Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. A couple of announcements. If you are joining us virtually, if you'll make sure you're muted, except when you have a question, obviously, you would unmute then. And I would suggest you not use the chat feature to ask a question because we just can't really monitor that. So when we get to the Q&A, if you'll unmute, that'd be the best way. Hopefully everybody will be able to hear it. If not, we can repeat it for those in the room. And for those of you in the room, I don't know that I need to say this, you kind of figured it out. We're not requiring a mask, so that's up to you, but if you wish to do that. Two other things. One, normally a class is 7 to 8, and we will do 2 30-minute presentations, 7 to 8. But the Q&A is going to start then. If you need to leave, we understand, but we're going to open it up for Q&A then and have about 30 minutes of Q&A. So if you need to leave or if you need to sign off, if you're online and you miss any portion, it's recorded. It'll be posted to the YouTube website. So thanks for joining us, whether you're in the room or virtually. I'm Mike Graves, one of the pastors here. And Vince Clark, who's been visiting for a couple of months now, we hit it off talking about all kinds of things, having coffee, and he's attended off and on along with his wife, who's here tonight, and he's a professor of modern European history, and so you can see some concern that he would have, but there's another tie as well, and I'll let him say that as he goes along. So please help me welcome Vince Clark.
Thank you. My wife asked me not to talk about the other tie, so but I will if you insist. So what we're going to do is basically I'm going to try to give you in a pretty short period of time the history of these two peoples that may or may not be closely linked together. The president of Russia has made a number of claims about the history, one of them being that Russia founded Ukraine, and you can judge for yourself as to whether that's true. I should also say that there are a couple of things that we need to know about Central and Eastern Europe, and the first is that until about 1800, people had no idea that each individual ethnicity should be represented in the state. So, for example, a good example I'll show you in a minute, but more recently, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had probably 10 to 15 different ethnicities, people who spoke different languages, even though the Austrians themselves spoke German. And this was, as I said, not a problem until about the time of the French Revolution, which is in 1789. And then people began to think that they all ought to have their own state, which, of course, as you can imagine, has caused endless problems because ethnicities are often mixed up. The other thing I need to tell you is that this is not an attack, is not going to be an attack on the Russian people. As you probably know, there have been huge demonstrations in Russian cities against this, actually more than has been reported in the American media, because these demonstrations took place all over Russia, not just in Moscow, but in places that the New York Times does not have correspondence. Most of the people were immediately arrested and imprisoned, and in most cases let go home. And you don't see any demonstrations very often anymore because, according to Russian law passed under Putin, 2 arrests for demonstrating could lead to capital punishment. So this is not about the Russian people. And as you'll see, the history of the Russian people is one of the saddest in the history of many sad histories. They have been mistreated by their rulers almost more than you can imagine. So once again, this is not about the Russian people. I've had Russian students who are brilliant, and I hope that they're okay. But that is not what this is about. So what we're going to talk about is we're going to go back to the beginning of both of these countries. I'm pushing the right button here, and I'm not sure that I am.
Just push the one on the right. Really good here. Didn't work. Of course not.
Okay, very good. So we're going to start at the very beginning, and that is with this guy whose name was Vladimir. A very popular name in both Ukraine and Russia. Vladimir, as you can see, was the dominant figure in what was called the Kievan Rus state. And he came to power in 862. This was a state that was formed of Slavs and also Vikings who had come down the rivers into what is today Ukraine. And the capital had been established at Kiev. I don't think it was much of a capital. It was probably some wooden houses thrown together with muddy streets. But at any rate, that's where it started. And Vladimir is sort of seen as the progenitor by both Ukrainians and Russians because he did something very important besides creating a state that could sort of hold itself together. And that is that he established a religion for both peoples. The religion of the Vikings was contrary to comic books, pretty horrible. It involved a lot of human sacrifice and a lot of fear. And Vladimir thought that in order for the people to have a decent religion, he would have to find one for them. So the story is that he looked at Islam, he looked at Judaism, but when he went to Constantinople, which was the capital of, at that time, what was left of the Roman Empire, he was completely blown away by the beauty of worship at Hagia Sophia. And so he said, this is the religion for us. He went home and, of course, like most rulers, simply forced everybody to be baptized. There was forcible baptism. And it's a lovely picture, which I didn't show you because it's obviously not historical, of Vladimir himself being immersed. This obviously is not what Vladimir looked like. It's not a photograph, but it's what people have imagined that he might have looked at. So I want to show you a map of Kievan Rus, the country that he dominated for a while. And if you look at this, I think you can see it a lot bigger. You can see that it extended over quite a large area. Down here at the bottom, you can actually see Lviv, but you can't see Moscow because it didn't exist as any kind of settlement at that point. The river, and I'm not sure how you get the stick here and show you. The river that you see flowing past Kiev, this is Kiev up here, is the Dnieper River, which has always sort of been the heart of Ukrainian settlements. At one point, there was a ruling that only Ukrainians could live on the west side of it. So, as I say, we don't see any Russian cities because there weren't any, and Moscow's out here. I looked up on Google as to how far it would be from Moscow to Kiev, and the answer is 563 miles. And Google also said that before the war, it took 9 hours to get there. Obviously, the roads are not too good, and they certainly were not that good back in those days. So that's the sort of the beginning of Kievan Rus. I want to show you another picture here. And this shows what happened to Kievan Rus, and that is that the Mongols, who were nomads from Central Asia, and as you can see on the map on the right, you can see the extent of their power. They were nomads. They sometimes established real states, but often they simply raided villages, killed people, stole things, and things like that. And they basically destroyed Kievan Rus for about 200 years. I have a very fanciful picture of Mongol warriors, but at any rate, that's sort of what you see here. And so what I'm going to try to do is to talk about, we're going to talk about Russians. We're also going to talk about Ukrainians. So I'm going to start by talking about Russia. And in the, much later than this, actually about 1500, Moscow became a center of Russia. And there are a couple of important czars or rulers during this time. One of them is Ivan III, who overthrew the Mongols and established a real state. And then his successor, Ivan IV, who was known as Ivan the Terrible, and that's an apt title for him, who turned the, once again, a photograph, absolutely, folks, who turned what it was the Duchy of Moscow, ruled by a duke.
I don't have a camera, right?
Good idea.
If you're at home, could you please mute?
Thank you. So he turned what was called the Grand Duchy of Moscow, probably an exaggerated term, into the Tsardom of Russia, and that was in 1547. And what this meant was that Russian power was now established in a place, and the place was Moscow, 500 miles away from Kyiv. It also radically increased the pretensions of the Russian state to being an important entity, because the word Tsar, of course, is the Russian word for Caesar, and Ivan the Terrible and subsequent Tsars imagined that they were Caesars like the Roman Caesars. Now, not all the Roman Caesars were good people either, but this is a huge jump up in status for them. The last thing that needs to be mentioned is that during this period, the peasants were forced into serfdom. And serfdom simply means that a peasant is not allowed to leave the estate of his owner. There are various penalties for this. Sometimes they were capital punishment. At other times, it wasn't that severe. Typically in Russia, peasants could not complain about how they were treated. And there were two reasons for that. Number one, the lord who owned the land and them, land was sold with peasants included. The advertisement would run, the peasants were called souls. So the advertisement would run so many acres of land with so many souls. So they almost literally owned these people, but the lord was the judge and the police. There was no state authority outside that. And in many cases, a complaint to the lord was considered a capital offense. So one of the unfortunate aspects of Russian history, the history of the peasants, is that, of course, with such disparities of power, rapes of women were reasonably common and complained about by some of the more enlightened writers. But of course, nothing could be done about that, because if a woman complained, she could be killed. And as I said, the Russian people were terribly mistreated. I should mention that about this time, and we're talking about 1550 or so, serfdom spread throughout Eastern and Central Europe. It had gradually disappeared in Western Europe because the Black Death had killed so many people that they couldn't afford to keep people on the land. They'd grab anybody they could find. But in Eastern Europe, in what is today Poland, Eastern Germany, and so forth, and Russia, of course, serfdom was imposed because there were so few people that to do the work that you wanted to make sure that they didn't run away. So that's a common feature. Whether Russian serfdom is much worse than other serfdoms is a hard question to answer, but we know that it was very severe. There's been probably more historical work done with Russia. That's because it's a big country. So typically historians, if they get a chance, will study big countries because more people know about them and write books about that, and nobody cares too much about, you know, the history of Latvia, for example, except of course Latvians. So, sure, we'll get to the next slide. Maybe this way. There we go. So at this time, most Ukrainians lived in an empire which was called the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. And this is a map of it. There are actually two parts. One part is the bright yellow part that you see here. And the other part is have a little different administration, but it's part of the same empire. Now, most people have never heard of this, but it, as you can see, pretty much dominated Central Europe for roughly 500 years. And it was a multi-ethnic empire. Of course, nobody minded that because the peasants spoke one language perhaps and the lords spoke another. It didn't make any difference. But you'll notice, and I've got to point this out, and I'll try to do it on both screens here, that this is the center of Ukrainian settlement. So basically, and I'll show you in a minute where that was, but this map, this is Kyiv right here. This map is in Polish, so it's a little hard to tell what it is, but that's Kyiv. And this is the Dnieper River that runs all the way down through here. And Russia, Moscow is not even on the map, it's out here somewhere. I'm going to show you on the other side here. So this would be Kyiv right here. This is the Dnieper River that flows into the Black Sea down here. And this whole section here was mostly settled by Ukrainians who were at that time called Ruthenians. And you might have heard that phrase. And this was a semi-official language of this empire. A couple of interesting things happened during this time, and one of them, which is sort of being duplicated again today, is that Ukrainians, of course, since Vladimir's time, had been members of the Orthodox Church, but their bishops became increasingly impatient at having to report to the primate of Moscow. And so they looked around for somebody else to take over it, and the person they found was the Pope. And so they created a church called the Greek Catholic Church. And the Greek Catholic Church, which still exists today, has Byzantine practices and liturgy. So if you went into a Greek Catholic church, and there are some around here, you would see an iconostasis with the icons. The priests were allowed to marry, but they had sort of a semi-independent relationship with the Pope. So in any area where there are lots of Ukrainian, say in Ukraine, of course, or in Chicago or Winnipeg, you will see both cathedrals for the Orthodox Church and for the Greek Catholic Church. And that took place at about this point. See here. So this gives you an idea, this map gives you an idea of the extent of this empire, which of course nobody has ever heard of before, except now you all have heard of it. And you will see the different ethnic groups that are roughly represented. So this is the Ukrainian area. And if you've seen a map of Ukraine today, you'll notice that it pretty much follows this line, these lines. And this is what used to be called White Russia or Belarus. Lithuania has been shrunk, and Latvia has been shrunk, and then Poland is here as well. So this is a map of that empire and where Ukrainians live. I should say a word about the language. Ukrainian and Russian are both called East Slavic languages, which means that they are about as closely related as, say, German and Dutch. And of course, many Ukrainians today speak Russian because they were taught Russian in school. So that's the reason why there's the connection. I want to jump ahead here or jump back to Russia. That. There we go. So in the 1700s, you'll notice that I'm skipping a lot of centuries here, but we don't have much time. There were a couple of powerful czars that made Russia even more powerful than it previously been. Before this, it was sort of on the edge of Europe and was viewed as very primitive, and nobody paid too much attention to it. But the first of these was a guy named Peter the Great. And Peter the Great was a monomaniac, I think that's fair to say. And his idea was that he was going to enlarge Russia tremendously and make it a world power. So he did expand Russia by means of a number of wars. And among the wars was the conquest of what had been the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They now became part of Russia. And what that enabled him to do was he had frontage on the Baltic Sea, which he did not have before. So that was a major step for him. He also built St. Petersburg and named it after himself, of course. And if any of you have been to St. Petersburg, you've seen that it was designed by Italian architects. Peter liked the best for himself, and built by essentially slave labor of Russian peasants who were conscripted as though they were in the army to build these gorgeous buildings. And of course, St. Petersburg is a major Russian port still today, and it had been the capital of Russia until 1917. It was moved from Moscow, which Peter thought was sort of a Hicksville. He wanted to be closer to where the action was, and he thought St. Petersburg was where it was. The other person to mention is Catherine the Great. You can see her picture here. She liked this profile. I'm not quite sure why. She was a minor German princess who came from a state that probably nobody has ever heard of before. And she was married to the Tsar, but she didn't like him very much. And so she connived at his murder and then announced that she herself was now the Empress of Russia. I think this went along with her learning to speak Russian so that she could talk with the various thugs that she had surrounding her. She had great pretensions. She considered herself enlightened, and she wrote letters, in this case in French, to people like Voltaire, which by this time, most of the Russian aristocracy was speaking only French. They weren't bothering to speak Russian. They thought that was for dogs and peasants. But she made the peasants' condition much worse and provoked a number of very widespread revolts with thousands of people revolting against her, which she managed to put down in a rather savage fashion. She also, and this is important for what we're talking about now, she also joined with two other countries in attacking and splitting up Poland. And those two other countries were Prussia, which was a German state, and Austria, which was a German state. So, let's see if I can move on here. So this map shows what is called the Partition of Poland. Partition, of course, is kind of a nice sounding word. The word they really should have used was dismemberment. And if you look at this, you can see that there are three stages in which Russia, Austria, and Prussia absorbed Poland, which ceased to exist. And this is the first time, of course, when many Ukrainians were under Russian sovereignty. Now we're going to skip ahead here. One of the things that was important in the middle of the 19th century, of the 1800s, was the abolition of serfdom, which took place for both Russian peasants and Ukrainian peasants, and in 1848 and 1868 in the Austrian Empire, they absorbed Poland, and in Russia in 1861 by Alexander II, who also, by the way, deprived Volga Germans of all of their special privileges and encouraged them to come to America. Now we're going to move up to the creation of the Soviet Union. And the first thing to say is that World War I was a catastrophe for Russia, which was largely responsible for starting it. At the end of the war, the Bolsheviks seized power in the Second Revolution in 1917. The Ukrainians attempted to create their own state, but eventually all of the ethnic states that had tried to become independent were forced into the Soviet Union. In the case of Ukraine, this produced, and many other places as well, this produced some real problems. Here. So in 1930, Stalin, who was one of the worst people in all of world history, he actually got kicked out of school because he was too mean. Decided that he was going to force all the peasants to give up their private property, which was usually 5 acres or less, and become workers on collective farms. The peasants were not amused by this, and there were thousands of people that were killed, deported to Siberia, and so forth. And the result was an agricultural catastrophe. Hardly any crops came up in 1931. Stalin viewed this as an excellent chance to get rid of the Ukrainians, who he thought might possibly at some time in the future be a threat to him. And so what he did is he had the army block off all the roads and railroads that would allow food in, and simply tried to starve them to death. He had originally thought that maybe he could starve 30 million people to death, but he only succeeded in starving 4 million. This is obviously a contemporary picture of some of the victims of that. We're going to skip farther ahead very rapidly. The Soviet Union collapsed from 1989 to 92. So the satellite states like Hungary, East Germany, and so forth broke away. Almost all of the nationalities within Russia itself decided to leave. They voted to leave, including Ukraine. The Russian portion became the Russian Federation, and for about 9 years, there was actually a democratic state in Russia, only the second in its entire history. One of the things that happened was Ukraine agreed to give up nuclear weapons, and Russia agreed to protect the borders. And that leads us into more problems. Putin, as you're painfully aware, I'm sure, became president of Russia in In 2000, he changed the Constitution so that he could remain president for life. He savagely stamped out the opposition, not only the opposition in Russia, but even sent his agents to kill people in England. He said repeatedly that ending the Soviet Union was a great historic tragedy, and he was going to do something about it. And he has spent the last 10 years trying to dominate the Ukraine. The last item in that list before he started this war was to seize the Crimea from Ukraine in defiance of international law. And now, of course, having been unable to do anything else, he started a war.
We're going to have Q&A at the end, so if you have your historical questions, you know who to ask. It's not me. So, theological perspective. Here's the way I've been thinking about this. In all the talk, whether it's on the airwaves or in water cooler, whatever, it seems to me three categories are what we hear about the most. Obviously, we hear political talk. Just a few examples: EU intervention, a historic kind of thing, even though it's not a NATO country. Run on banks, China hedging its bets and maybe looking to get Taiwan. So, political talk. You also hear a lot of military talk. So whatever news you follow, these are the two most prominent categories. You'll have retired generals, and they'll talk about arms, the stalled convoy, weapons. You've been hearing about all of that. And then economic. We also hear about sanctions. We hear about possible cyber attacks, perhaps here. Price of gas, of course, which, some people say, well, that's a minor inconvenience. There are people dying, but it's not a minor inconvenience for some people. For some people, it's a very serious thing. But what's noticeably absent are the historical context, which we just heard, and the theological context, which we used to hear. And I'll say more about that in just a minute. I think there are some typical Christian responses, neither of which I find very satisfactory. First one is there are some fake prophets out there who are coming out of retirement, Matt Robinson famously, to talk about the book of Revelation and how this fits into the end times. There honestly could be a good use of Revelation right now. Revelation was written against the current Roman Empire and the emperor, who was a Caesar, and we now have a czar kind of history in Russia. So you could, in responsible hands, do good work with Revelation, but the work that's being done, not so good. It's all about predicting end times. The second thing that's being done is nothing. There are traditions in Christianity that are so focused on personal morality, they'll say nothing about what's going on in the world. And I do mean nothing. I gave an historic example, but this is honestly the truth. In majority of churches in America during World War, Hitler's rise, they didn't talk about it. Some held him up as an example because he didn't smoke or drink. But there are churches, and I'm saying this from firsthand experience of people I know the last 2 weekends at their church, not a word was said, not a word. So I don't find those to be good responses. So what is? Well, the most common response, and this would be true among progressives as well as conservatives, is to pray. The problem is that can kind of sound cliche in a moment like this. But I get it, because when you're powerless, you want to do something. So we pray, but we're going to at least start there. We're not ending there, but we're going to start there. So I want you to notice that I've labeled this a historical perspective, a theological perspective, not the. Nobody can claim to say, here is the Christian response. And what I want to say about prayer, I would call also a view of prayer, not the, because nobody can speak for everybody's views on prayer. But I want to at least give you 3 things to think about. And they may be a pretty big challenge to your notion of what prayer is. Prayer is relationship, solidarity through prayer, and the need for lament. So let me just kind of work through those. Most of us, we don't mean to, but we think of prayer as a transaction. We might start with a few niceties like, Lord, I love you, I praise you, but we're going to get down to business. And we're going to say, God, we ask that you put an end to this war. We pray for peace. We pray that Putin would change his mind. We pray whatever. But that's not the only way to think of prayer. If you went to lunch with your best friend, you would talk about the Ukrainian situation. Well, that's a way to think of prayer, is you would talk to God about the Ukrainian situation. You would say how you are feeling about that. You would talk about that. So when some people say, I'm so sick of hearing about, well, you be in our thoughts and prayers, as if that was somehow a bad thing, really thoughts and prayers are not that much different. You know, the notion in the New Testament that talks about pray without ceasing, always praying, that's really what they're talking about, is that we're always in the presence of God, and every thought we have, every word we say is in the presence of God. And so it's the idea of sharing with this God how you are feeling, how you are processing, not just praying for those things. Now, that's not to say that the intercessory, pray for peace, pray for Putin to change his mind, pray for the troops, pray for those poor people that have no food and water in Mariupol. Yeah, of course, but it's not the only way to pray. And if our heart is breaking, sharing that with God can be important. This morning I was watching the news and they gave a warning. What you're about to see is going to be graphic. And it was a man crossing a street, suddenly mown down. And I got sick. I mean, I've seen that on so many movies, but I got sick. In the moment that I felt that, that was a prayer. That's a prayer. So that's one of the ways to think about prayer, is as in relationship. The second way is solidarity. Instead of thinking of it as a transaction, what if we imagined us entering into the skin of those who are suffering? So one aspect of incarnational theology, this Jesus becoming flesh, is that Jesus enters into our suffering. And I love this. Paul in Romans, there's a lot of different words for prayer, but one of them, the verb to pray, in Romans he uses, is literally agonize with me. And the context in that case was agonize with me about the saints in Jerusalem. But you can agonize with God, with the people in Ukraine and in Russia. And I think, you know, this question I raise here, what does it mean in talking to God to imagine what others are feeling? So when you see that news story, which I heard this afternoon, of the people who are isolated and they're running out of food and water, and the humanitarian corridors aren't working, and they're dying. When you pray, you can enter into that suffering. That's not to be discounted. But this is where my heart goes first. Lament. This is a Jewish tradition. There's a whole book in the Bible dedicated to it, Book of Lamentations. I'm guessing that you don't read that book very often. It's very depressing. This is the time to read it. There are more psalms in the 150 collection that are laments than there are praise. If you ask people and say, what do you think the most common word is in the 150 psalms? Most people would say, oh, it must be praise, or thanks be to God, or bless. No, it's lament. How long, O Lord? Why have you forsaken me? That is the most common refrain. And I'm going to show you one example. But first, I remember when I first finished my PhD and was starting to teach, going to chapel during the first Gulf War. And the context was going to be a service about that. And I thought, oh my gosh, what's my colleague going to do? He's leading this chapel. What's he going to say? And he said, the most honest response to war starts with lament. It's acknowledging the sadness, the sorrow of that situation, and acknowledging that God is broken over this. the violence of humanity. I mean, that's one of the first things you hear in Scripture. It's like chapter 6, God is sorrowed over the way humanity is acting. So I'm going to read it to you. And I should, like on the news when they told me, warning, this is going to be graphic. Warning, this is going to be graphic. Now, it starts with 6 verses of lament, sorrow, but then it shifts. So here's how it begins. By the rivers of Babylon, and let me just put in context, Israel has a history, just like Russia does, just like Ukraine, everybody does. And part of their history is being taken captive by another army. In this case, the Babylonians. The southern part of Israel, those southern nations, was taken by the Babylonians, and most of the elites were carted off into Babylon. So this is what they write. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung out our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. You hear the sadness. Now you're going to hear something else. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down to its foundations. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, blessed shall be they who pay you back what you have done to us. Blessed shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. It's hard to believe that's in the Bible. It reminds me of something Elie Wiesel said at one of the Holocaust remembrances. When he prayed, he actually prayed. He said, God of all mercies, show no mercy to those who have shown us no mercy. Now, you might, I don't know what you're thinking, you might say that is not the right way to pray. Well, it may not be what we aspire to, but if that's how you feel, then it is the right way to pray because it's how you feel. And you would say that, I know people who've gone to lunch with their friends and they've said things like, I wish Putin would die. The book of Psalms would call that a prayer. So here's what Amy Richter says about lament. It's a prayer for God to act. But as with other kinds of prayer, it acts on the one who prays as well. And that may be the strange alchemy, is what she calls it, of lament. To cry out to God is to take action. So what sort of action then might Christians take besides praying? And this is what I heard many of you asking. What can we do? What can we do? So what comes to mind for me are 2 things. One is social action. And that's not a long list here. It's just an example. Sanctions, possibly war, writing Congress, etc., protests, whatever. Some people say a protest does not change the situation. And the response is, no, but it can change you. It can change you. You can work out some things. But the other thing is personal action, giving to help with the needs. So we're going to talk about these things. So first we'll start with social action. Missing from the discourse, I mentioned this earlier, is a theological voice. Instead, what we have nowadays is journalism. We're a secular place now. You may not want to be, but we are. And what we now have is we turn on the TV and we rely on whatever your news is. But that wasn't always the case. America's most significant theological voice would be Reinhold Niebuhr. And the influence that he had on Bonhoeffer, on Martin Luther King, on Abraham Joshua Hessel, it's unbelievable. He's best known for his serenity prayer, which you may know. We'll say more about that in just a minute. He's a Missourian. What do you think about that? He was born in Wright City, just outside of St. Louis. It was to a German immigrant family. I think you can hear that in the name. And so World War I left him and much of America absolutely reeling. Most of Americans at the time, if they weren't born here, were German Americans, and especially in the Midwest where he was. So the defeat of Germany in World War I, everybody's just trying to figure out, what does this mean for the world, for them? He went to seminary, and when he came out, he took a pastorate in Detroit, and this was very influential on him. In particular, taking on the labor practices of Henry Ford. And then, of course, the Great Depression. This influenced him greatly. He argued, this shows you just how much of a prophet he was, in the late 30s, when people were holding up Hitler as just this great politician, he said he needs to be stopped. He became a professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York, big heydays of that school, and he influenced the civil rights movement in the 60s. This is what happened though. With his sermons each week, he wrote a prayer. And in the summer of 43, this is the one he wrote. God, give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things that should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. If you have that prayer memorized, you might be saying, that's not the way I memorized it. I'll show you why. So Niebuhr contended with people on the left and the right. On the liberal side, there was this notion that, well, they called it, the 20th century was nicknamed the Christian century. There's going to be nothing but progress. Of course, 2 world wars sort of put an end to that notion, but that's how it started. This is on the heels of the Industrial Revolution. On the conservative side, there were people who just, as I noted earlier, they just ignored social justice issues. So he wanted to speak to both groups. So the prayer was penned in response to World War II. And several aspects of it are worth us looking at. He uses first person plural, not I, not give me, but us, not the singular. Grace, not serenity, is the first petition. It's grace with serenity, but grace is what he prays for, and that's a very bold thing. And then here's the most important line. The prayer actually reads, courage to change the things that should be changed, not that can be changed. And then wisdom to know the difference. You hear the significance of that? So you could say, well, you know, I can't change that. That's not the barometer for him. That's not the measurement. The measurement is, should it be changed? So will you have the courage to try to change that which should be changed, even if it can't be changed, even if you are powerless? Will you find that? And then, of course, this wisdom to figure out, how do I know the difference between these two? We need a prophetic voice like this that is so often missing. So here's where it gets complicated. He was a pacifist, as am I, but he became a realist. It was called the Doctrine of Christian Realism. Ultra-realism, not his version, posits that evil will always be with us, power is the only answer. And this is the most common approach cited in the military. You know, the military hawk side, at least, will say to a dove, you're naive. It's more complicated than that. They're evil. We got to eradicate this. Okay? Theological realism says, yes, there is evil is real. We can't be naive about this. But it shouldn't be how we live and act. And then here's the important part. Although war may be the lesser of evils at certain times. So let me just show you how complicated that is. Prophet Isaiah, this is what's on the UN, right? They'll beat their swords into plowshares. Prophet Joel, still in the Bible, says, no, we'll beat plowshares into swords. Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. Same gospel. Jesus says, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. These sentiments, both sides of that, have been expressed throughout Christian history. I gave just two examples of the extremes. Earliest followers of Jesus were not allowed to serve in the military. First couple of centuries. But, of course, crusades eventually in the name of God. The list goes on and on. So I have this saying in my study at home. I am already against the next war. I picked it up during one of the Gulf Wars. But here's the thing. I used to tell my students it's very easy to be prophetic in hindsight. Hitler's rise to power, for example. There are very few people in the world who would not say that was a total disaster. There are a few, neo-Nazis, etc., but majority of people. But those people didn't say that at the time. Bonhoeffer, by the way, when he came over to study with Niebuhr, he came over twice. He studied with him. When he came the second time, Niebuhr said, please don't go back. You can't go back. You're going to die. And his response was, then that's what I have to do. I mean, he really lived the prayer that Niebuhr had prayed. Civil rights of the 60s is just another example. Denominations have been repenting of their racism for a long time. But yeah, 50 years later, they say, oh yeah, we were really wrong about that. And they continue to do isms now. You can fill in the blank. It's so much harder to be prophetic in the present. But there can come a time in the face of evil when sanctions don't work and war is justified. It's called just war. So what about personal action? All right, so I won't embarrass you and quiz you, but often missed in the story of the Good Samaritan, maybe you know the story, man's going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, he falls among thieves, they rob him, they strip him, they beat him, and then comes some people by. The priest comes by and he crosses to the other side, Levite comes by and he crosses the other side, and then a Samaritan comes by. And when he sees him, and what does he do? Okay, I'm not going to ask you, but most people, I've quizzed them for years, they say he took him to an inn and gave him money and said, if I owe you any more, I'll even pay you that. And that's true, but it's missing a very important part. Put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And then he took out his wallet and said, here's some money, and if you need more, I'll pay that too. Before, that phrase, throw money at everything, before the Samaritan throws money at it, he takes care of him. So I'm just going to be out there and be bold. Some of us might consider traveling to Eastern Europe to serve in refugee camps. You want to know what to do. Or it's not Ukrainians, but you could minister to Afghans who are arriving here as refugees. And then I love this quote from Miroslav Volf. The world's needs are larger than any one person's capacities, though they're not larger than our collective capacities. So Ben and I put together a list. And I started with the Week of Compassion because that's our denomination's arm that is supporting that. And you can go to our website and you can see that there's International Red Cross, the World Central Kitchen, Velvet Ukraine, Doctors Without Borders, Save the Children, and probably many others. And of course, you want to do due diligence to make sure this is a reputable organization and do your homework. But you can do that as well. So we're going to open up the floor. Ben, you might come on back up because I'm guessing there are going to be questions for you and hopefully for both of us. If you're at home, remember to unmute and ask the question, and hopefully we'll hear you. And if you're in the room, speak up enough so that the owl, this little device is called the owl, so that it can pick up your voice. But any comments, questions for either of us? Go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking of it. one of Putin's claims is in going on this attack is that he wants to reunite ethnic Russians. I mean, are there indeed this vast number of ethnic Russians in Ukraine today that either want to be with Russia, but they just have, sometimes, like I'll say three, the border, one person lives here, but the border keeps moving, and they're French and they're German, they're French and they're German. And I'm just curious of that eastern border of Ukraine there onto Russia. I mean, what's the ethnic makeup near that border?
There are people who do speak Russian, who are ethnic Russians who live in that area. Within the Soviet Union, of course, they mix people all around. Putin has been conducting a low-scale war in those regions for the last 10 years or so. And the idea, of course, was to see if he could peel that away from Ukraine. One thing he hasn't done is to take a vote.
So I've read that.
Can you speak up?
I have
Sorry.
read that the Ukraine was tempting or doing bad things to Russia across the border. So I assume that's just false.
As nearly as I can tell, yes, except, in this area where you had Russian speakers, I mean, that's their native language. Most Ukrainians also speak Russian. But there, since the last 10 years, there have been agents of Russia that have been imported, plus the Russian military to stir things up. So it's a little hard to tell exactly if we could take a vote or if you could sort of break that out, what would actually happen. It's not exactly like the convoy of truck drivers, because this is legally part of Ukraine. It was agreed to by treaty. And what Putin has a history of doing, which he's done with Chechnya and Georgia, which were once part of the Soviet Union, but are now independent states, but Chechnya is part of Russia, is he picks on some little border incident and then uses that as an excuse to send in the Soviet army, the Russian army.
Two more questions, more like what's happening kind of like today in the conflict. And that is they captured this one Russian soldier. He said that we've been told, all the soldiers, the people in Russia, that the Ukrainians are Nazis, that they have become Nazis. And I guess is the propaganda, I mean, even with all
That's just completely false.
but I'm saying, is in today's modern media with internet and people pick up Facebook and signals everywhere, do they have that much of a block on information getting in there so Russia can control the narrative and do total propaganda?
Well, it does. They are jamming Ukrainian and other media. Of course, there's their social media. The Russians are trying to control the internet as well. But many Russians do not understand that this is a war of aggression. There is an interesting story in the paper today about a man who lived in Ukraine and his father lived in Russia. And he called his father up on the phone and his father said, "How's everything going?" And he said, "We're in a war." And he said, "What war?"
He said, "What war? There's all those Nazis in Ukraine."
That's all the Nazis. That's right.
I saw Katie Allison wants to ask a question. Katie, can you unmute and ask?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to sort of make a comment. I got in late because I was on another Zoom because of an organization, and the Secretary of State of Latvia was discussing the whole particle. And one of the questions that came up was, what about the people that speak Russian? And he said, you have to realize they have about 20% of Latvia. And then he followed it at all the other countries. And he said, you have to realize countries like Latvia and the rest of them, they are either 40 or greater years removed from being attached to Russia. And he said they don't speak the Russian language without an accent now. So they're not Russian and they don't want to go over there. So I don't know whether that answers the question. I don't know who answered it in the office. But the other thing he said, and Mike, this to what you brought up was, he said, if you want to do something, he said, protest. He said, protesting will get there. Protesting as a blanket protest, however you want to do that, protest.
Thanks, Dave.
I would say that the boundaries that are currently established between Ukraine and Russia, between Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania are established by international agreement. And one of the issues is, can a country just say, well, we don't like the international agreements we've already agreed to, so we're just going to conduct a war to change them? And that's obviously a situation that simply can't go on existing. You can't have a civilized world if one country just decides to start invading another.
I was wondering if
Yes.
you could comment on the religious dimension. So what percent of the Ukrainian population speak Catholic? And then there's conflict between the Russian.
Right. Well, just as of this Sunday, the figures are that about 65% of Ukrainians are Orthodox, and I don't know how that divides between Greek Catholic and Orthodox. In 2017, some Ukrainian Orthodox formed another Orthodox church, and the names are almost exactly the same as the original Orthodox church. And this one has no connection with the primate in Moscow. So all I can say about that is that the Ukrainians historically have had the ability to snub the primate of Moscow. So I don't know whether, the primate of Moscow, of course, is an instrument of the government and has been for many years, long before communism. When the World Council of Churches was formed right after the Second World War, there was a question as to whether to admit the Russian Orthodox Church. And the contention was made with a lot of evidence that the officials were actually members of the KGB.
And for those who don't know, the three branches of Christianity, and we tend to just think in the States about Catholic and Protestant, but the Catholic Church split with the Orthodox Church in 1054, the East and the West, and then of course the Reformation's in the 16th century. So really Christianity has a whole branch that we tend to in the West just kind of ignore, which is unfortunate. But, yeah, Paul.
A couple of American firefighters yesterday told us to watch a documentary that was based on Chernobyl. It's on Amazon Prime. It was a real very big cultural documentary around the world last night. But sir, if you speak to like again, whatever news we listen to, sometimes give a slant.
Well, Chernobyl, of course, was exploded under the Soviet Union, and it's in Ukraine. And it was sort of stabilized. It has been off limits to most people since then because it's impossible to determine how radioactive it still is and where the radioactive pockets are. And one of the things that shocked many people was that the Russian army actually attacked Chernobyl a couple of days ago. The dangers of releasing all of that radioactivity are really unknown. Nobody knows exactly what that might do. So that's sort of the background of that. People have seen it. Those who sympathize with Ukraine have seen it as an example of a complete irresponsibility.
Or intentionality to.
intentionality to,
Yeah, and destruction.
but you don't know how far that radioactivity might spread.
Definitely watch that documentary because these women, they were published, and look, snuck back in and look.
Mhm.
I put that video there, see it in their school. Not in person.
There are other radioactive sites also in Ukraine that are potentially in danger, although I don't know how close the Russian army is to them at this point.
Didn't they attack an active nuclear plant last week?
They did.
They were sending rockets.
It was a plant that was generating power. That's right.
I heard that a significant part of Ukrainian power is nuclear power. Russians control 3 or 4 plants that significantly impact electricity.
I, for one, am extremely concerned that this conflict is ripe for a miscalculation way beyond what has happened already. And I don't necessarily mean from the Russian side or the Ukrainian side. I just think when there's this much conflict going on in a part of the world where parties are so close together with so much armament that an overflight, a misdirection of a missile, we could have a much, much worse situation than we could really much think about.
Well, Putin has put his nuclear arsenal on alert, whatever that means.
Yeah.
It's not really too clear what that is.
Yeah,
But whether this is a bluff or whether it.
Yeah, and I take all that sort of stuff, I call that with a grain of salt. But there's a lot of steps in between the tactical nuclear devices that should he become more desperate or there be some miscalculation or accident occur, an incident, either manufactured or not. I haven't had this type of feeling since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It's, there are many different opinions about what kind of person Putin is. There is apparently very good American intelligence about what goes on in with his counselors, because they were able to announce several days in advance that Putin had decided for war. But nobody knows really whether he's reckless enough to start the Third World War or not. Yes.
So do you think Putin will go after Estonia, Latvia, and the other one as well?
I don't know. I mean, I think that the fact that they're in NATO would tend to deter him from doing that, because the treaty that binds NATO is an ironclad pledge that all the countries in NATO will defend any country that's attacked. I don't know. I don't know that there's somebody who understands his psychology well enough. He's been considered by some American politicians to be both very clever. And whether this is cleverness or something else, who knows? Yes.
I was gonna say that I was minded, we have changed quite a bit because of this
It's, I think most
Psychologists would say it's hard to do psychoanalysis at this distance.
This is kind of a question for you, but I know right now it's just the mission. Coordination of the churches are just charities to do what they can when they're outside the country. You said the military.
Yeah, they all work with people there, all of the different organizations. You know, like today, I mentioned at Mariupol, the afternoon report about they're isolated, they have water's been cut off, no food, can't get in or out. So different organizations are taking different tacks depending on what they had in place already. And, you know, you could look, I mean, if for instance, you have a certain burden or something, maybe some of them are ministering in a certain area as opposed to another, you know, like sanitation or food or that kind of thing.
Is there any talk of Ukraine just some realize?
I haven't heard that. I know that the countries to which they're fleeing are having a severe crisis,
Yes.
trying to, and fleeing Russia as well. Yeah, I mean, there's a huge humanitarian crisis right now in Eastern Europe, for sure. I wouldn't be surprised, although it depends what Congress would do. You know, there's the whole Afghan thing as well.
You mentioned, well, one of the questions is, what are we thinking about the framework? And previously, we talked about Bonhoeffer visiting Niebuhr and him saying, stay. It's reminiscent of Zelensky saying, I don't need a ride, I need arms. How do you think we, as people who are involved in faith, can help create a theological framework led by a prophet? I mean, not how we can just pick somebody out of the air to be Reinhold Niebuhr, but it seems like historically, like, you know, many things that happen are underpinned by things that haven't happened when they needed to. So how do we go about putting forward that concept that a theological framework is needed to consider this in addition to economic, military, etc. And how do we, as many congregations, because there's three services, there's the disciples, there's many of them. How do we go about creating synergy among that group of people to be against that next board that you have a button about?
Well, it's really hard because we don't have the voice that we had. You know, I mean, there was a time in American history where the parson in town was the educated person, was the voice, was the literate person. And the church, you know, in what's called post-Christendom is very isolated. I mean, the people that get in the news in Christianity are the people who have jets and are scheming on the side for you to support their ministry. So, I mean, we don't have the voice. You know, Niebuhr was on the cover of Time magazine on its, I think it was its 25th anniversary. Reinhold Niebuhr was on the cover. That just doesn't happen anymore. Unless there's a scandal about a certain minister, then it could happen. But as a voice, it's just not there. And I don't see the news channels, you know, after the general comes on, after this politician, and after this former ambassador, those are the people that I see. I don't see them saying, and now we're going to go to Serene Jones at Union Theological Seminary. So it'd be nice if we could make some press by protesting for the right thing. Occasionally Christians do, but it's extremely hard.
If I could just say, dealing with the case of Bonhoeffer, it was very, very difficult to decide for him or any of the other people in the resistance what to do, because at various points it seemed as though
there were other alternatives or maybe no alternatives. And Bonhoeffer himself spent about a year plotting against Hitler in Germany before he was finally caught. But there were all sorts of ideas among the resistance there. There were people who thought, well, the best thing to do is to get a good deal so that the British will let us go back and run things the way we were. But I mean, it's very complicated. I think you expressed that very well, that there isn't any instant answer to any of these questions.
Right.
The fact that it's complicated should not prevent us from trying to make strides.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And that, I think that's what troubles me the most. We hear so much about, well, nothing I can do about it. I'll give him $50. And the $50 is important, but it doesn't change the systemic issue of how dictators rise to power and how the theological framework is no longer front and center.
Yeah, and it's a cliche, but it's got some truth in it. The girl throwing the starfish
Yeah,
back into the water, and someone says, "Are you kidding? There's 10,000 of them. It's not going to do any good." And she throws one and says, "Did that one good?"
yeah.
I mean, there's truth to that. The $50 does matter. It just doesn't feel like enough, and I would say it's probably not. But you guys figure out, Niebuhr's prayer, what for you is. What can you do?
Maybe that's something we should do. We should publish the actual Serenity Prayer rather than others.
Well, and I think the complications of this is one of the reasons why theologian will never make the news, because it's not a soundbite kind of discussion. It's something that, they need at least 30 minutes to actually go into and talk about all of the variations of what's going on with the thought process. And so it'll never make it.
And I think you're also correct that especially Protestant churches have lost a lot of their public power since the 60s.
Yeah, and the kind of conservative pockets of Christianity that aren't concerned with world issues tend to be more on the airwaves. And Christianity that has a more progressive social bent has tended to let them have the airwaves and have resisted even being on the airwaves because it felt like they would be lumped in with the televangelist approach. It's false dichotomy in my opinion, but that's.
There used to be a Protestant hour.
Yes, there did. There used to be a lot of things. Anyone else?
Well, do you think the sanctions will eventually cause strife and unrest within? And part of it is hopefully within Russia itself. They'll do something to help.
Niebuhr actually says that his doctrine of Christian realism doesn't just acknowledge that you may have to go to war, and it may be just at times, like Hitler's case, but he also said that it was the leveraging of the protests. In other words, and this is what's true of the 60s actually, civil rights, King could do nonviolence forever, but it was leveraging the nonviolence by the Montgomery bus boycott when it hit the pocketbooks. So some people believe if you really want to make a difference, you got to hit the pocketbook and that will eventually sway, but I'm sure that's more complicated too.
How long does that take?
Right.
Well, also, of course, he had a lot of help from Lyndon Johnson.
Right.
Well, I'm thinking about, I can't remember the exact story, but there are these black hearts in people's yards all around Shawnee Mission. Maybe I'll notice them, but this is the part I can't remember. I know it was a high school student who created that black heart. I can't remember which high school.
Sold them for $10 or something.
Sold them for $10 a piece, came up with that design herself. many people have them in their yards now. And I think, I feel like sometimes we get immobilized by discussions like this, because it's impossible. How can you change Putin? You can't. And so then I was just sitting here reflecting on this high school girl did that, and it kind of launched in this area a big Black Lives Matter movement, and they're all still in people's yards. So I don't know. Sometimes you got to start small.
Yeah.
And not be overwhelmed.
Yeah, this is something important. I was at the Y today, and the guy in front of me on the treadmill had this blue and yellow sweat outfit. And the top was blue, and then he had a stocking cap. And something found him. That was, yeah, and it was very, it was very subtle, but he was making the same.
Yeah, so I don't know, we can do something. I'm not sure what it is, but.
We have colors represented back
There you go. Is that intentional? Was your outfit intentional? Absolutely.
Are you at the Y?
Well, the last slide, I simply put the prayer back up. So this is at least one prayer we offer tonight. God, give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed. Courage to change the things that should be changed. And the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other.
I have a quick, could you send that out, and we could all put that on our social media?
The prayer?
The original, this one?
Yeah, it's online.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
How did it change?
Yeah, there's actually a long story. If you want to know the story, it's a great story. His daughter, Elizabeth Sifton, wrote a book called The Serenity Prayer. And it's the true story of the prayer and how it gets changed. And it's kind of a long process, but yeah, it just sort of morphed over time.
It's the Bible, and they had to begin all meetings.
Yeah.
With,
Yeah, and a lot of people have attributed it to all kinds of other groups, but Niebuhr's the one who wrote it.
You could Google the question, who wrote the Serenity Prayer, and see how many different answers.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for being here, and safe travels, everybody.
Thank you.